University of Austin, I hope to repay your attention by being honest, interesting, and brief, and especially brief. I encountered St. Augustine when I was 18 in a residential college much like this one. In that environment, I learned to read and discuss philosophy, sometimes, in fact, to discuss without reading, but University of Austin students don't know anything about that. Augustine's Confessions was the first book in our course. Mostly we found it boring, full of things that didn't interest us, and light on things that did, like Augustine's concubine. Though I shared this general reaction, I recognized St. Augustine. He reminded me of myself. He could never stay in one place, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. A wanderer in more ways than one. He was always looking for bigger answers to more slippery questions. Amazingly, however, this dreamy young man made an indestructible contribution to civilization. His works became authority in the Western Church. Not his ideas alone, but the very book he wrote came to shape the lives of a civilization. His distinctive choice of life and his meditation on how we should make our own choice of life set the pattern and standard for Christian civilization, both the meaning of history and the meaning of an individual life. Augustine's great work is the Confessions, and the Confessions is a book that takes life as its subject. It is an autobiography because the particular life under discussion is Augustine's own, but the book is about life in general, its shape and meaning, and how we should spend it while we've got it. We should pay attention. We also have a life to lead and something to learn from his life. It is hard to narrate the story of Augustine's life without reverting to the way he tells it in the Confessions. All of us first learned the life of St. Augustine from St. Augustine. He tells a sticky kind of story, and rather than describe it, let me just tell you one. I met an old man in a Barnes & Noble in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He was a bit like the ancient mariner. He held me with his glittering eye and told me his life story. His early life had been destroyed by alcoholism, costing him marriages and fortune and family. He had a vision of himself in hell, ripped down in a metal chair into a sky of red smoke. Not long after, he ran out of gas on the side of a country road, and Christ appeared to him, 100 feet tall, bright as a neon sign, and my friend fell to his knees and worshiped. After that, his heart was cleansed, his drinking days were done, and he began the rest of his life. This is indeed what happens in the Confessions, and in John Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, and in many of our novels of coming to adulthood, which often end up as spiritual autobiographies. They are stories about a change in the heart, a crucial change that permanently alters life direction. It is a powerful story, an empowering story, because it suggests the individual may begin again and establish a new source of life on his own terms. The most thrilling part of writing such a narrative must be rewriting historical events of your own life as steps in a transformation that leaves you an enlarged person. The form is also replicated, I say with respect, in memoirs of addiction, abuse, and trauma. Augustine's biography takes this form. Here is Augustine's story as we get it from the history books, and they get it from the Confessions. Augustine was born in Thagaste, North Africa, in 354. He lived his life between Roman North Africa and Italy, moving between them. As a product of the Western Mediterranean Latin civilization, Augustine moves between these Roman provinces with very little of the culture shock that would surprise a modern traveler moving from Tunisia to Italy. His father was a pagan businessman, his mother a Christian named Monica, a saint who gives the name to Santa Monica, California. His real name is indeed Augustine. I was desperate to find another name for him, something more personal. But no, his name is Aurelius Augustinus, which I think is a very pretentious late Roman Empire kind of name. If he has a nickname, it doesn't come down to us. The centerpiece of the Confessions is Augustine's long-delayed conversion and baptism, delayed, in fact, until his 31st year. Neglecting to honor the efforts of his pious mother Monica, Augustine wandered through various philosophical and pseudo-religious sects while in pursuit of a career as professor of rhetoric, a role that perhaps bizarrely in the Roman Empire could be a gateway to political power. St. Augustine considered his conversion and baptism very carefully, so that even after he had decided to follow Christ, he hesitated to be baptized. Ancient Christians took their theology of sin and forgiveness very seriously. Most of us who are familiar with Christianity have this picture. The Christian converts, she is typically baptized, and embarks on the Christian way of life. The expectation is that she will probably fail sometimes, and she will be able to return to the church for forgiveness. Baptism is not the absolute boundary of sinfulness. Baptized Christians are expected, though of course not encouraged, to sin. And I think this is the familiar picture for most of us today. In the Christianity of Augustine's time, it was not so clear that you could be forgiven for sins committed after your baptism. Once you converted, you were expected to live a Christian life, trusting that your baptism had washed away all the sins of your previous existence. If you failed in your new life, once baptized, your fate might well be sealed. To avoid this harsh discipline, it was common to live one's whole life unbaptized and be baptized only on one's deathbed. This is what the Emperor Constantine did. Though the emperor converted to Christianity after his victory in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he remained unbaptized until the day of his death. As Constantine's example indicates, such a practice was especially common for powerful people. At this time, more Christians believed that a life of political power was incompatible with a Christian life. St. Augustine's mother, Monica, also believed this, for even though she wished him to worship Christ, she did not want him to become baptized until after he had made himself a career. After all, a career in Roman politics, though lucrative and prestigious, would inevitably involve the spilling of blood, and perhaps on a mass scale. This presented a problem for Augustine. He was extremely talented and ambitious, marked out for success in a field that rewarded power of speech and use of language, especially the law, one of the pathways to power in the Roman world. Augustine's personal destiny was to be a man of affairs, prominent and involved in imperial administration. And his literary education at Thagaste and later Carthage served this goal by stocking him with a background knowledge and aesthetic and philosophical sensibility of the cultivated Roman senator. In all these studies, Augustine tells us, his parents, quote, only care was that I should learn to make the finest orations and become a persuasive speaker. Roman education for men like Augustine consisted largely in stocking them with history, poetry, philosophy, and art that celebrated their civilization. Especially the champion of the eternal city, Virgil, the epic poet who sang the founding of Rome in the Aeneid. Virgil was not just a poet, but the embodiment of the Roman spirit, which they called Romanitas. Virgil created a hero in Aeneas who combined the highest Roman aspiration and dramatized Rome's greatest military political rivalry with Carthage, and did so in a language and mythic register that imitated but seemed to rival and surpass the culturally authoritative poems of Homer. The result was a poem rich with symbolic depth, but also strongly identified with Roman power, prestige, and tradition. A quick word about the Roman Empire. Augustine stood at what now looks to us like the end of the Western Roman Empire. He lived through the sack of Rome in 410, and he died within half a century of the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, which students of my Crown Cathedral Crusade class know when that is. Anybody want to say? 476. 1453 is fall of the Byzantine Empire. Thank you, Sasha. So in the 5th century, we might assume that the Roman Empire was a dismal place, teetering, bankrupt, and ready to fail. But there is absolutely no reason to hasten Roman decline. There was plenty of reason to think Rome could last another 1,000 years. It had gone through difficult periods before. I mean, consider the conflict with Carthage, the devastation of Hannibal. That had been overcome. Rome had watched tremendous civilizations over 6 centuries bow the knee to symbols of her greatness. Therefore, the young Roman of the 4th century the 4th and 5th century was not choosing between Christ and a dying empire, but between a living, everlasting ideal, that is Rome, the eternal city, and the city of God, the invisible community of Christian saints, known only to God himself, though which the scriptures describe as more glorious than the earthly Rome. To secure a position of dignity in the empire, Augustine needed the poems of Virgil as the cultural wealth of the Roman upper class. Eric Zolkowski sums up a critical commonplace when he writes that Augustine was, quote, so thoroughly saturated with the poetry of Virgil that lines and phrases from the Summa Poeta crept into his writing almost of their own accord. The Aeneid fills a small but memorable part of his narrative in the Confessions, his boyhood education, which I've already mentioned. We have the experience in his own words. I liked Latin very much, he tells us, but why I detested the Greek language, I have not yet fully discovered. By Latin, Augustine means, quote, what the grammarians teach us, including literature, not the basics of reading and writing, which he makes very clear he did not enjoy learning. We learn that he composed verses and that he understood the principles of writing Latin poetry. Quote, I was not free to put any foot where I pleased, but in different places according to the meter I was using. And in one line I could not use the same foot in every position. Nonetheless, the art I was practicing, the art of poetry, did not have a different law for different places, but the same law throughout. In another place, he describes a memorization contest he competed in as a young man. I remember once, when I had made up my mind to enter a contest for a poem to be recited on the stage, some magician, I have forgotten his name, demanded how much I would be willing to give him to be certain of victory. I loathed and abominated the filthy rites they practiced, and I told him that if the wreath were of gold, and immortal at that, I would not allow a fly to be slain, that I might win it. The connection is clear. Interest in worldly things like Virgil lead to the disgusting practice of thaumaturgy, even worship in filthy rites. And Augustine now knows these rites are in fact addressed to demons. I should add that he follows up the story later with a confirmation, in case we were wondering. As a matter of fact, he did win the contest without consorting to demons. All his life, he remembered passages of Virgil by heart, as his frequent allusions to the poet indicate. But now, to him, at the time of writing the Confessions, as an older man and a bishop, these are vain and destructive. In a famous passage where he describes memorizing Virgil, Augustine's tone is strident. He was, quote, dying when he studied pagan literature. Quote, I was forced to memorize the wanderings of Aeneas, whoever he was, while forgetting my own wanderings, and to weep for the death of Dido, who killed herself for love, while bearing dry-eyed my own pitiful state. in that among these studies I was becoming dead to you, O Lord, my God, my life. Few readers of the Confessions forget this scene, writes David Bennett. The elder Augustine, looking back on his boyhood, crying for the fictional character Dido. The example has become, quote, paradigmatic of a father of the church dealing with his pagan literary past. There is irony in Augustine's choice of Dido, Queen of Carthage, as subject of fascination. In the Aeneid, we follow the Trojan hero Aeneas in his journey to escape the disastrous destruction of Troy and found his new kingdom in Italy, which will lead in due course to Rome. The Dido episode is from the Odyssey-like first half of the narrative, and it features Aeneas finding himself waylaid in North Africa, where he starts up a romantic relationship with a Phoenician queen, Dido. When the Queen of Heaven witnesses Aeneas's dilly-dallying with this queen when he should be out founding Rome, Zeus, or Jupiter, sends Mercury to restore Aeneas to the true path. The tears of Dido come when Aeneas answers the call of Jupiter and sets out again for Rome. As several critics have noticed, Augustine's own story parallels that of Virgil's epic hero. Like Aeneas, Augustine is at this time delaying his own destiny of baptism and commitment to a life with Christ. This commitment is what he wants, but he finds himself distracted, especially by physical loves. The young Augustine humbly asks God to take away his lust, quote, but not yet. In a larger sense, for Augustine, his misspent youth reading Virgil and seeking love are part of the vanity of all pagan culture. Virgil himself represents Rome as a political and even theological idea, as well as the completion of a certain type of career, a poetic career that followed a structured progression that led to the heights of power in Roman society. By praising and serving the emperor, Virgil followed a traditional path which led to a literary relationship with Augustus. Praise of Rome and Augustus, partial as both may be in the Aeneid, secured to Virgil permanent influence and power, not in political terms, but in intellectual, literary, historical, and even ideological terms. Virgil was Rome, an authority in a society that prized the ancient and traditional over the young and innovative. Can you imagine that? Though the poem is a literary masterwork, it is also buttressed by impenetrable cultural prestige. Hung on the horns of the Homeric poems, graced with the purple of Augustus, celebrating an empire on the rise. Virgil is the single most influential poet who's ever lived, at least in the West. He was the central author in the ancient literary curriculum, and he was the central author in the medieval literary curriculum, and the central author in the Renaissance literary curriculum, and the central author in the 18th century literary curriculum. He was therefore the most studied author at all places in Europe, more or less, at all times, more or less, between Augustus and Napoleon. No one has ever been more influential than him, and with modern communication giving us ever more writers, no single writer ever will be so influential again. Even in the 4th century, Virgil's fame would have seemed likely to endure for many centuries to come, as indeed it did. Therefore, if joining government did not interest Augustine, he might aspire to literary or philosophical greatness. He had proven himself a great orator, like Cicero, and a philosopher as well. Augustine might join his name to the constellations of great ones that surround the Roman name, men like Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Seneca. If not by political power, by his mind, Augustine might earn himself the laurel of fame. Or he can give up all this, poetry, oratory, government, and follow Christ. We must see that this is a very hard choice. Right, Christian? Hard choice. In the very making of a life plan was a decision about the nature of the universe. If what mattered most is money, power, and the pleasures of the flesh, the path of the aspiring politician is relatively clear. But if what matters is knowing God aright, what sort of life should we take? As it happens, Augustine is pushed along in his crisis by the death of a close friend, a story he tells in moving detail. I quote at length, "During the period in which I first began to teach in the town of my birth, I had found a very dear friend who was pursuing similar studies. He was about my own age, and now was coming as I was to the very flowering time of manhood. He had indeed grown up with me as a child, and we had gone to school together and played together. It had become a friendship very dear to us, made the warmer by the ardor of studies being pursued together. But you in the confessions is always God. But you are ever close upon the heels of those who flee from you. For you were at once God of vengeance and fount of mercy, and you turn us to yourself by ways most wonderful. You took this man from the life of earth when he completed scarcely a year in a friendship that had grown sweeter to me than all the sweetness of the life I knew." Augustine tells how they baptized his dying friend when the end looked near, only for his friend to recover. On learning that his friends had baptized him, the dying man was mortified. He knew what this commitment meant for his soul. Expecting him to laugh and joke about the whole thing, Augustine is shocked by his friend's reaction and resolves to express his own feelings to him later, feelings raised by the strange spectacle of this unexpected baptism, a baptism that throws Augustine back on his own problems and hang-ups. But then, before an Augustine can speak to his friend and express his feelings, his friend dies. Augustine writes, "My heart was black with grief. Whatever I looked upon had the air of death. My native place was a prison house, and my home a strange unhappiness. The things we had done together became sheer torment without him. My eyes were restless looking for him, but he was not there. I hated all places because he was not in them. They could not say, 'He will come soon,' as they would in his life when he was absent. I became a great enigma to myself, and I was forever asking my soul why it was sad and why it disquieted me sorely. And my soul knew not what to answer me." If, like me, you can look back at the days of your teens and 20s and recall faces, important then above all others, that are no longer around in your life, maybe no longer around at all, then you will be moved by Augustine's memorable evocation of the loss of a personal friend. It was an intellectual friendship, as Ada said. Augustine and his friends were companions of the same order, lovers of truth, beauty, and God. I don't know if you have any friends like that, but I hope you do, because it's what it's really about. So Augustine became a great enigma to himself. He has received a vision of wisdom and beauty, but he received it from the philosophers, especially from Cicero in his dialogue, the Hortensius. He has not yet come to accept Christ, and he remains unbaptized, a part of the pagan world of blood and buying and business, a part of Rome. But at the end, his friend had not died a philosopher. He had died a believer. Augustine is experiencing now the pull of a life lived by faith, but he does not yet give in. We should see that the struggle of this part of the Confessions is in a certain way also the struggle of his great work, The City of God. In the time of Augustine's life, there were indeed two cities, great transhistorical realities, one called Rome, one called the Church. Rome was an empire, the Church a voluntary community of saints. For Virgil, the empire was a sacred institution born from the decree of Jupiter. For these I set no limits, world or time, but make the gift of empire without end. Lords of the world, the toga-bearing Romans. Augustine is, in a sense, choosing between his membership in these transhistorical communities. Which of these cities could pay off the eternity she promised? In the end, Augustine converted for entirely personal reasons, because of the appearance of God in his life. The scene of conversion is personal and unforgettable. No private affair. He sits with his friends Alypius and Nebridius and others, discussing the life of St. Anthony, which some of you have read, and urging each other into the conversion. Later, Augustine is alone. A mysterious child appears to him in the garden, chanting, "Tolle lege, tolle lege, take up and read." Augustine picked up his nearest Bible and found the words of St. Paul, "Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in clamoring and impurities, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh and its concupiscences." That's a fun word, concupiscences. Don't get to say that enough. Augustine says, quote, "I had no wish to read further, and there was no need. For in that instant, with the very ending of the sentence, it was as though a light of utter confidence shone in all my heart, and all the darkness of uncertainty vanished away." Why did this gesture of picking up the Bible, a book after all that he'd read before, and reading it constitute a moment of conversion? For Christians, the answer is simple. The Word of God has mysterious power. But in the ancient world, a similar practice of sacred reading existed called the sortes Virgilianae. In this practice, a person seeking advice, often a royal figure, would randomly select a line of Virgil, that is of the Aeneid, and use it to interpret his personal destiny. At this moment, Augustine feels a call to pick up and read, but it is not Virgil but his own scriptures that take the place of the canonical documents. It is an act of renunciation. Pagan culture is left behind, together with its literature, whose teaching Augustine will now immediately give up for good. In taking up his scripture, Augustine is turning his back on that culture, that city, in favor of his own hidden, transcendent city of God. Augustine's conversion is therefore not only personal, though I said it was motivated by personal reasons, it also marks a turning point in the literary and spiritual history of the West. In fact, the very form he chose, autobiography, announces something new. Spiritual autobiography, as exemplified by Augustine's Confessions, represents a profound swerve, in Harold Bloom's sense, from the Virgilian model of epic. Where Virgil charts the ascent of empire through fate-bound deeds and public duty, Augustine turns inward, mapping the soul's errancy and its reclamation by grace. More than a change in content, the Confessions is a revolution of genre, from public verse to private witness, from cultural myth to interior testimony. In a sense, Rome conquered the world by arms, and the Aeneid narrates the conversion of the world to a Roman Empire. Christianity conquered by the offer of grace, and the Confessions narrates the radical terms of that second conquest. We're going to zig for a second. I want to remind you now of another young man, myself, who found Augustine in that live-in learning program at a large southern state school. From there, I migrated to the Ivy Leagues, to Yale University, brought there purely by the trust of my advisor, the beloved John Rogers, who plucked me like grazed desert flower and replanted me in fitter soil. I have embarrassed John before by speaking of him in public, but I have not yet embarrassed my other teachers, Lawrence Manley, David Quint, and David Castan. Your trust in me brought me from obscurity to the center of prestige and knowledge, a trust that to this day imposes on me an irrevocable demand against which I cannot beg or bargain. Indulge me. Yale, a place gilded or haunted, if you like, by names. Cleanth Brooks, Harold Bloom, Thomas Green, Jeffrey Hartman, John Hillis Miller. How little these names mean to you, how much to us who knew them or knew those who did. Men of the 1950s and 1960s who were humanists in their bones, and their companion at Harvard, M.H. Abrams, and at Columbia, Lionel Trilling and Jacques Barzun. A friend of mine from Yale once described them as men who tried to provide a liberal education every time they spoke. They assumed responsibility to know all points of Western history and philosophy and to admire all classic literature. If someone asked if they had read a classic, acceptable responses were yes or a shamefaced not yet. If they read less than 4 languages, they were ashamed. How great are the changes I see when I look out over these same institutions today. How few are the Jacques Barzuns? How few are the Lionel Trillings? How few and irreplaceable are the Harold Blooms? My own self-esteem, from having tasted that standard of excellence and Catholicism of taste embodied in my teachers and my teachers' teachers, derives from the constant effort of self-improvement. Forever reading, forever learning anew, with eye upon that constant star of complete knowledge joined to complete humanity, which cliché calls the man of the Renaissance, but that true lover of beauty and goodness the American poet Hart Crane called the visionary company of love, that communion of my many fathers, whose love and wisdom many ages long have passed from heart to heart as sacred fire, with more than religious, with an evangelic fervor, that the best of man's efforts should always live on in heralded futurity, to welcome all generations to the brotherhood of their civilization. And I hope to see emerging swiftly, very swiftly, graduates of the University of Austin, men and women riveted to our traditional American faith, not to partisan slogans, but to liberty and order, civic courage, self-government, and devout submission to the moral law. And I hope to see these wise and fortunate men and women armed and disciplined in all the arts, sciences, and technologies whose use will decide the fate of fortunes and of empires in our coming 21st century. Now, storied institutions like our great universities, like the Roman Empire of Augustine's age, often miss the signs of their own decline, but Augustine did not. If there are any among you considering large shifts of ideas, look to St. Augustine. He is an example of a mind in motion, a mind observing itself in motion, and observing that mind will help you understand your own case better. Augustine saw his choice in civilizational terms, Roman or Christian. You might find yourself faced by just as profound a choice between American liberal capitalism and some other idea alive with future possibility. Or perhaps you're considering religious faith. Consider the patience and prudence of Augustine, who embodies the hope that the choice of life can lead to truth, not only to power and popularity. Augustine was guided by the love of the Latin tongue to the preaching of St. Ambrose, and by the love of learning from the God of Cicero's Hortensius to the God of Jesus Christ. In the first poem of In Memoriam, Alfred Lord Tennyson describes the hope that comes from the possibility of change in the human heart. I held it truth with him who sings to one clear hope in diverse tones, that men may rise on stepping stones of their dead selves to higher things. If you want to know how to turn your dead selves into stepping stones, read Augustine's Confessions. But in the end, he didn't choose Christ over fame. Augustine's baptism consecrated faith of an entirely other order. As the authority of the medieval Latin Church, in time, Augustine became the most influential theologian of the Christian West, one of the most influential theologians ever. And while Virgil's Aeneid would be studied by Christian professors for 1,000 years, they would do so knowing that it was just a story. But when they read the Confessions, they would do so knowing it was the truth. Not only his truth, but their truth, our truth, the truth. Ironically, by placing Christ at the center of everything, ironically, St. Augustine won his laurel of fame. Thank you. What's your name, sir?
My name's Theo. I'm a bit disappointed that I haven't had any classes with you as my professor yet, but the question I would like to ask is, not really a question. Could you please elaborate on the effect of his friend's death for St. Augustine? That wasn't very clear to me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry if I was unclear. Augustine and his friends had not converted at that, well, they had converted, but they had not been baptized. They had not embarked on the full Christian life, which they understood as a very deep, almost monastic commitment. That's what they had in mind. So they were all kind of wanting to do it, but they were scared. So when Augustine's friend died, or when Augustine's friend almost died, was baptized, Augustine talked to him, and, it wasn't like a stranger being baptized. It was his friend. It was the guy that he had shared all of his kind of inner thoughts and spiritual longings with. And to see that guy having made the plunge and then die, it just destabilizes him, and it pulls him, but it also kind of holds him back at the same time. When you read it, I would love to get your perspective on it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Greene. This was a great talk. I feel like everybody in this crowd is energized after today. With how much reverence they placed on baptism at that time, with it being the completion of the expression of faith, what was the perceived view of the thief on the cross at that time, since he wasn't baptized?
I couldn't say, which is something you should hear your professors say a lot.
Thank you.
Sorry.
How did Augustine change after he made the decision to get baptized?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate that question, because there is a big change. I mean, the biggest change has to be, in a funny way, it's the opposite of what Augustine was expecting. Because Augustine and his friends had been kind of living like monks already. They'd been kind of living like rich monks, wealthy monks, just discussing philosophy and hanging out all the time and talking about the spirit and praying and stuff, which is what they thought the Christian life was. But when Augustine does convert to Christianity, this is not his Christianity. He does not sit around talking about ideas and, that kind of thing. I mean, yes, ideas are important, but he becomes a bishop, which is a very, very important social and political role. He tries to negotiate with the Vandals when they're attacking North Africa. So in a funny way, what happens to Augustine as after he converts is that he becomes much more public and much less kind of soul-searching. Hope that answers the question.
Ironically, asking for less questions has led to a lot more.
Okay. Hi, Merrick.
I know that you really love Horace, and when you taught Sublime and Beautiful, you talked a lot about how wasn't this just sublime? Isn't there something of the divine in this poetry? Poetry that's pagan.
Yeah.
Did Augustine, when he turned away from pagan Rome to the city of God, entirely leave behind any appreciation for the sublimity, whatever is divine in the pagan verse of Horace and others?
Thank you, Merrick. That's a great question. I want to read the quote earlier because I think riffing on this will let me answer the question. I was forced to memorize the wanderings of Aeneas, whoever he was, while forgetting my own wanderings, and to weep for the death of Dido, who killed herself for love, while bearing dry-eyed my own pitiful state, in that among these studies I was becoming dead to you, O God, my life. Now, I think Augustine is a very sincere person for the most part, and that's part of what makes the confession so powerful, but this part reads to me as quite phony. He does not mean this, I don't think. I mean, I couldn't prove that, but it's just it's so rhetorical, for one thing. The way he says, I was weeping for Dido, but I was bearing my own pitiful state, dry-eyed, it's very kind of classical rhetorical. And it becomes extremely important because this is a big turn away from pagan literature. It wasn't obvious that was going to happen. At the same time, you have Jerome, St. Jerome, who he makes his peace a little more with pagan literature. But Augustine does kind of a big pivot. And I think he does so kind of strategically, not really because he thinks that it's actually, that's not putting it fairly. I think he still loves it, but I think he actually probably does see his love. I should be clear. I think he does probably see his love for pagan literature as part of his helpless case, being continuing to be sinful, right? He wants to have his love for pagan literature taken away in the same way that he would want to have his lust taken away. And the two things are related because pagan literature is full of lust.
Okay, so it's normal to lie to God about these kinds of things.
Just sit down.
Hello. Okay, with your assertion of Augustine being one of the most influential theologians ever, having conceptualized such fundamental ideas like original sin, divine grace, city of God, etc., what does it say about the nature of Christianity that this figure was infamously lustful and impious for much of his life?
I think it says very, very great things about St. Augustine, that he struggled the way he did and talked about his struggle. I mean, that is core to the Confessions. And I think it's really core to Christian leadership in general, is being kind of a wounded healer, not pretending to be perfect. And so, this is St. Paul too. I mean, the good that I would do, I do not want to do, right? And the bad thing that how does it go? You know what I'm talking about. That's authentic. I don't see anything bad about that. Yeah.
So during the Zig, you had a lot of conviction about the different principles that are part of UATX, pursuit of truth, sort of transcendence towards knowledge, and there are a lot of paradoxes on that front. In a capitalist society, how do you reconcile philosophical life with participating in capitalism? Can there also be a selfish element if you're just pursuing truth and you're not helping others in any sort of way. So how would you reconcile those things?
Yeah, let me take the second one first, because I think the fact that Augustine spent all his first 31 years pursuing truth meant that when he had a hold of it, he fought really hard for it, defending his city, Hippo Regius, as I said, against the Vandals, defending orthodoxy against heretics of various kinds. So once he actually kind of was done pursuing truth, once he thought he knew what the truth was, he was not a reed in the wind. He was very committed, very, very committed political, public person. So there's no sense in which he's out of the world. What he does is Christian ministry, helping people and, leading all day long. So that. And then the first part was, how do you reconcile capitalism and philosophy? I think capitalism has obviously been pretty good for philosophy, because it makes people wealthy, and wealth allows people to spend time doing the finer things. And I think our civilization is built on the tremendous wealth of capitalism, and I would hate to lose that. And I think it would be a giant mistake to lose that. And if anybody thinks that the philosophical life is incompatible with wealth, check out Seneca sometime, the wealthiest man in Rome, also a very significant philosopher. Did it corrupt him? I don't know, read Seneca and find out, but a lot of people think not. So I think that, money, capitalism, philosophy, why not? Why can't they go together? What do you think?
So the problem is that Aristotle really espouses leisure as the ends, at least the ends of occupation and all these other things.
Yeah.
But it requires a sacrifice of years of time to get to a point of wealth so you have that leisure. And that time can't necessarily be just for a philosophical life.
Or become a professor. My life isn't leisure exactly, but it is the class. In a way it is. It's the classical idea of leisure with dignity, which is, it's not leisure to, I'm quoting Paul Friedman here, and I'm stealing his jokes, so I feel bad about that. He says it's not leisure to surf dubious sites on the internet, right? It's leisure to think, to read, and converse. And the leisure for that does exist. I think, this place is evidence of that. But I think it is important. And I think let me say something practically. If you are making a life of business or politics or whatever, great. But do try to make space in it for leisure. I think that will be possible, dignified leisure. I don't know. If you don't believe me, try it. Or don't.
Thank you.
Do you think that you have to experience a great deal of suffering or to really touch death in order to develop a level of spiritual maturity like Augustine did?
Yeah. Don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This question has very little to do with Augustine, but maybe there's something similar in his. Why should we study literature when we can become entrepreneurs?
Wait, say it again. Say it more slowly.
Why should we study literature and become poets passing heart to heart in the spirit of fire like Hart Crane when we could make $100 an hour?
What's behind that question, Yo?
A recognition that there is a divided impulse in the school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I like to focus on men like Augustine and the kind of education they got is because in some ways the kind of education they got is a little bit like the kind of education that y'all are getting. But the Romans didn't think it was a kind of education just to become a professor. Augustine did, but that's a kind of being waylaid. It's a kind of mistake, right? The expected path is to become a lawyer or a politician. Now, that's not exactly the same as being an entrepreneur, but it is not identical to a life reading poetry all the time. Why then did the Romans think that these people needed to know poetry? Why then did the Romans think that these people needed to know their history and have a philosophical education? I don't think it's just because they wanted people to learn certain skills, critical thinking. You're going to learn critical thinking. Or even, with all due respect, debate or seeking after truth or a lot of those things. I think a lot of it actually had to do with prizing the civilizational wealth of their civilization, of the Roman Empire, and the civilizational wealth that belongs to all of us in the West. It's pretty awesome. It includes Proust and Battlestar Galactica and Virgil and Homer and the Book of Genesis and Pokemon. Well, no, not Pokemon. I guess it's ambiguous. But it includes a lot of things, and that is not. That's not ephemera, It's like our jewels. This is understood better in Europe, I think, where if you go to France, you can find streets named after Malebranche and Descartes and Montesquieu and stuff like this. They understand this better in France. They understand that cultural wealth is important, and along with cultural wealth, cultural pride. And so that's a part of it, I think. And I think that's more the core than people think. Though the other things matter too. Thanks, Yo.
Hi, I'm Noble. My question was, in Augustine's Confessions, he brings up his mom quite a bit more than your speech had the proportions of.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, it seemed like when I read it, that Monica had a really strong role in Augustine's transformation through his life. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think that kind of relation or authority in one's life to be held accountable has any really spiritually significant role, and how have you seen that in your life?
So you're talking about a person who holds you accountable in a spiritual sense, especially a parent?
Yeah.
Well, let me first say about Monica that, I didn't emphasize Monica as much as Augustine actually does. I hope that y'all talk about Monica in your classes. It's actually a kind of important thing to talk about because it's very interesting. They have a very interesting relationship. I sort of didn't want to spoil that. I wanted to spoil as little as possible. I had to talk about the conversion or I wouldn't have spoiled that. I tried to not give it all away. Now, what kind of leadership or mentorship did Monica offer, and did I ever have anything like that? Yeah, I certainly did. A lot of people who had a lot of patience with me, saying a lot of very silly things, throwing out every ridiculous thought I ever had, every turn of my mood, and people just being like, nope, this is still true. That's important. It's really powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your talk today.
Hey, sir.
Hey. I wanted to touch on what I think might have been a contradiction in your talk.
Okay.
So you talked about how there's been a lot, the evangelical furor that used to exist around a liberal education has died off. There are no longer professors like there used to be. There is no Strauss anymore or anyone like that. At the same time, you talked about how Christians want to denounce the pagan literary tradition as not fully encompassing the truth. What I mean is, how do you bring back any sort of passion for liberal arts when it's pagan in nature?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really think I understand your question, but let me give the answer that occurs to me, and you can tell me if it's not, if it doesn't answer it. I think we should look also. I didn't really talk about this because I was sort of not defending pagan literature, but trying to be a little sympathetic. That moment where Augustine dismisses pagan literature is very significant. To throw away so much intellectual work and so many traditions of teaching and education and everything like that it's a bold move. And he had to have a strong justification, and it was God, it was divine law. I mean, the strongest justification. But I think whenever you're kind of consolidating a tradition or revitalizing a tradition or setting out on a new path, you have to kind of look back at the past and pick what's good and what's bad. So, for instance, I would say, especially the last few centuries of art, we shouldn't just kind of immediately accept it and say, like, everything. I mentioned Proust earlier, which I began this year by trying to read, and hasn't gone so well. But we shouldn't just accept that, like, he's got the right morality and theology and everything like that. Like, obviously not. You should have a critical attitude. And maybe even an especially critical attitude to things that come up in the 19th and 20th and 21st century. I think that'd be very reasonable. Maybe the 18th too, though I think in terms of poetry, the 18th was more traditional. We should have that critical attitude and, pick stuff that's consistent with our values, faith, truth, the truth, etc. I've tried to answer your question, but...
Yeah, I think I could ask a little bit more, but maybe I'll talk to you later about it.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Hi, Jake.
Hi, Professor Greene.
Am I in trouble?
No, you're not.
Okay.
Well, first I want to thank you for that extraordinary talk, which I received as more of an event, perhaps, than a lecture. I was particularly impressed by your evangelical fervor, as Sam put it, on behalf of liberal education. I was very pleased that I recognized at least some of the names that you mentioned, including Lionel Trilling, who is one of my favorite literary critics. But I actually do have a question, and it relates to the relationship between that evangelical fervor and leisure. And I think probably most people in the room know, or at least I hope many people know, that the Greek word for leisure is skole, the root of our word school and scholar. You're shaking your head? Okay,
I didn't know
good.
that.
It's a remarkable fact. And there is a particularly excellent book, I think a highly prophetic book, by a philosopher named Joseph Pieper called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, which he wrote. He gave it as one of two lectures, the other being what was named the Philosophical Act. He was a German thinker, and he gave these lectures in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, when Europe was rebuilding, and education was focused on necessary skills and tasks that were essentially sort of like, restoring the infrastructure and restoring the economy. And so everything had to be useful. And his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, or his talk, which is now a little book, basically was protesting against what he called the total world of work, right? As if education simply had to be useful. And his notion that leisure is the basis of culture is, the way that he talks about it is, he talks about the Sabbath, he talks about God, he talks about how opening ourselves in silence, right, to the universe, to the world, to the goodness, to beauty, to truth, to all those things that you extolled, is absolutely crucial for the refreshment of the human soul, the refreshment of culture. It's this kind of deep wellspring from which all these good things flow. And I should say, by the way, his book has a little epigram from the Bible that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And the Greek word for be still is skolasete, right? Be at leisure, that is, right? Now, you might guess where I'm going with this. Your evangelical fervor, which was quite delightful, was extolling what you might call an attitude of work. You talked about how these professors, if they didn't know at least 4 languages, they were ashamed. If they didn't struggle and suffer and gather and learn. Where does leisure in the Pieperian sense come in?
in my own career, leisure was for undergrad and hard work was grad school. And that's a bit of a joke, but I think there's something to that, which is grad school is not supposed to be entirely fun and games, right? And that's where you make the transition to, I kind of know French to I need to, know exactly which French authors I'm going to be reading and learn Latin and all that. But I think undergrad should be about leisure in this good sense. And I think if you all understand what you are doing properly, you will understand that this is leisure, that this right now is leisure. This is refreshment and enjoyment. And if there is going to be a kind of refreshment of our civilizational and national life, I think it will have to come from people who know the value of leisure. And I hope that this is the place for that leisure. Because I think, like you said, the root of the word is our word school. And if we're a school in the best sense, we're a school that teaches people to be at peace with themselves, with history, with the universe, with God if they believe in God. And act from a deep place of rest as well as conviction. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jake.